Well, you thought wrong. Think better. Where were we? I wish it had the chapter subheader at the top of the page instead of the title of the book. But here we are. Returning again to Disneyland of the Gods by John A. Keel. He obviously owns all copyright, or his estate does. Or whoever owns the rights to all this obviously owns the rights to all of this. I am not trying to um, make money off the literature. I'm trying to make money off of reading it. Foot and mouth disease. Hardly a month passes. Oh, I'm sorry, I actually need to do something that I've forgotten I needed to do until this exact moment. And if I don't do it, I'm going to be, bothered by myself. That needs to come out. There we go. That's better. Hardly a month passes that some scientist or member of the academic community doesn't pontificate for the press and chew a bit on his own shoe. A recent candidate for the coveted Foot and Mouth Award is a retired British physicist named Dr. Kurt Mendelsohn. At a meeting of the American Association for the Advancement of Science, an organization that seems headed by Alfred E. Newman, Dr. Mendelsohn soberly announced that he thought Egypt's 6 major pyramids were all built within a single century by 70,000 out-of-work farmers. One, the Meidum Pyramid, was redesigned in mid-construction when it partially collapsed, according to the scientist. It is quite possible that Dr. Mendelsohn has never been to Egypt, or that he may have done his research in the air-conditioned lounge of Mena Hotel at Giza. I lived in Egypt for a year, and I spent much of that time exploring desert ruins and visiting most of Egypt's 90 pyramids. I spent several days inside and around the Great Pyramid of Giza alone. I have been continually appalled by the pseudoscientific rubbish spun by experts around the ancient structures. I am particularly annoyed by the Everest-sized mountain of garbage that has been published about the Great Pyramid. The ancient Egyptians left us complete records on everything from weddings to crop failures, but for some mysterious reason they didn't bother to produce a single papyrus explaining how the pyramids were built, when, or by whom. This is no longer actually true. It was true in the 80s. It's not true now. We found them. So archaeologists have been engaged in a great guessing game for centuries, often ignoring all the known facts in their struggle to support their own hypotheses. Scribblings on random stones, graffiti left by ancient work gangs, have often been accepted as conclusive evidence of the identity of the tomb's occupants. A drawing of a horde of workmen hauling a huge statue with ropes is regarded as proof of how the huge stones of the pyramids were moved. The workmanship in the Great Pyramid is impressive and is generally superior to the workmanship found in the other pyramids. Much has been made of the fact that the largest single block in the Great Pyramid weighs about 80 tons, and the question remains: how did the ancient Egyptians move these enormous blocks from quarries hundreds of miles away? The question doesn't actually remain. The question didn't remain in the 80s. What is true, however, is that archaeology until about 2008 was very dumb. Most pyramidologists overlook other smaller pyramids which contain stones weighing almost twice as much as that Great Pyramid monolith. Surprisingly, several of the small pyramids pose questions far more puzzling than those offered by the Great Pyramid, and this is also true. We now know that pyramid building was once a universal practice throughout the world. Over 6,000 years ago, unknown peoples were assembling great pyramids in Mexico. Gigantic man-made mounds were constructed in China, Great Britain, North America, and on remote Pacific islands while the Egyptians were still living in mud huts along the Nile. During World War II, pilots flying the Hump reported seeing one or more massive pyramids standing silently in isolated Himalayan valleys. This pyramid stuff he's doing is a little bit silly. He's wrong about the South American pyramids, their date. He's wrong about how the antiquity of the South American pyramids. They were built actually in the Middle Ages, in the European Middle Ages, about the 12th century or the 13th century AD, something like that. And then pyramids in the Himalayas are silly. That didn't happen. Most of these early mounds were built slowly in layers over a long period of time. On special religious holidays each year, the natives would gather to haul laboriously baskets of dirt and stone to the mounds and complete another layer. From Babylonia to South America, it was the practice to erect a special temple on the summit of the mound or pyramid. He's talking, ziggurats and pyramids are no longer considered the same thing. The choicest local maiden was then selected to wait in the temple for a visit from some mysterious god. This is true. The god was supposed to descend from the sky and have sexual intercourse with the sacrifice, except not the descend from the sky part. It's just the sacred king. He's getting the sacred king rights wrong. Tables, chairs, and beds made of solid gold were placed in these cosmic bridal chambers because, according to legend, the gods were attuned to the frequency of gold. This is also emphasized in the Bible. The wandering tribes of Israel went through a lot of trouble to build gold artifacts which they left on mountaintops for the gods. Children born from the supernatural liaisons were given special status as rulers. This is true, but not because of the sky or gods of the sky, because of genetic democracy was the only way they knew how to do things. And the way they arrived at genetic democracy was through prima nocta. They were man gods in the eyes of their followers. That's true. Who were these sexy gods of yesteryear? Were they astronauts from some other planet who viewed our world as a kind of celestial playboy club? No. God in itself was a totally worthless ore to early man. Gold in itself was a totally worthless ore to early man. That's not true. It didn't tarnish. Gold doesn't naturally tarnish. And it's easy, it's malleable without high temperatures. So you can fashion gold objects. Hey, Jazz, you can fashion gold objects of beauty and decorative. You can fashion decorative gold objects to beautify a town or a home or a person, and they'll never tarnish. All you have to do is polish them, and they're beautiful. That's also why bronze was prized. Gold and bronze were prized at the same times in Earth history. Bronze became a weapon material, but very, very few people groups actually use bronze for weapons. They use bronze for tools and gold for beautiful things. This is why they made gold weapons at the same time. Bronze weapons were more threat than lethal. So it's not true that gold was totally worthless. Gold has been the standard of valuable things since we figured out how to make it into other things, because it doesn't tarnish, it doesn't rust. Scarce in supply, it was too soft for use for tools or cookware, and it was difficult to mine. But all over the ancient world, it was regarded as a sacred metal. The gods put us to work mining this stuff from Africa to Brazil, and this, whether he believes it or not, the gods did put human beings to work mining it. But again, that was about the religions needed it in order to compete. The religions that found that centered these tribal peoples, that centered these cities, they needed gold. They needed to make that choice female. It wasn't just because she had a particularly beautiful body. It was all females, and they wore a particular outfit, and that outfit was often made of gold. Like if you look at what Puabi was wearing in the century he's describing, the outfit that the queen of Ur, as we call her, was sent to her sacrificial death in wasn't gold. It wasn't even clothes. It was beads on strings to cover her naked body in beautiful handmade beads. Um, these women didn't go around in what you think of. They didn't have the kind of modesty that you think of. They were beautiful, they were extremely athletic, and they wore almost nothing. So he's wrong about this. The gods put us to work because the religious institutions said that the gods needed their daughters to be decked out in gold in order to sleep with the golden sun god, their king. We fashioned holy objects from the metal and left them in temples and tombs where supposedly the gods appeared and carted them away. They didn't cart them away, they didn't tarnish. They would never go bad. The point of putting gold clothing or gold objects in the grave with the person is the effort to get it, the effort to shape it, and the intention of giving it back. That's all. From the very beginning, man's purpose was to provide slave labor to supply the gods with gold and female companionship. When we say, what's the point in acquiring riches? You can't take it with you. That was the point. That was the entire point of acquiring riches in the earth, or in the ancient world, was to give them back in a massive ritual ceremony of sacrifice after death, was to for your community to prove that their devotion to the god, their devotion to tradition, their devotion to the ancestors, their devotion to you meant that they weren't going to divvy up your belongings and forget you. They were going to put them in the ground with you and remember where all of that treasure was. And then someday, when they had forgotten, someone would find it, and that would be the blessing of a lifetime. Boethius actually uses that example. From the very beginning, man's purpose was to provide slave labor to supply the gods with gold and female companionship. This is in the Book of Enoch. This is universal to countless legends from every part of the world. And that's not true. It's universal to Enoch. The pyramids and mounds were part of a worldwide system to serve the gods, not just worship them, with one exception. So what he's doing here, being critical of this ancient religion, he's being critical of this ancient religion because the later religions were critical of it. He's not going far enough back in his history. Why? Because he couldn't in the 1980s. We only have anthropology on this very recently, within the last 17 years. So far as we know, the Egyptian pyramids were not part of this system. There is no record indicating that Egyptian virgins were left in pyramid chambers surrounded by gold furniture to await the arrival of sex-starved astronauts. Yeah, there is. They had a sacred king. His name was Pharaoh. There absolutely is. This is what his wife did with her time. She had a sacred couch and a sacred chair and a sacred bed, just like all of them. Why? Because this religion came into the Ice Age with human beings. It didn't develop coming out of the Ice Age. The residue of these ancient beliefs is still with us, and that's why he needs to reject them in the way that he is. We still furnish our churches with gold artifacts and even embellish their ceilings with gold leaf because it never tarnishes. All you ever have to do is polish it, and rarely. Emperors and kings in many parts of the world, such as Japan, still claim to be direct descendants of the ancient sky gods, and that is a later development. The direct descendants thing is a later development than the gold itself. Over a long period of time, the temple system degenerated and demonology intervened. The young maidens now had the gold or the beautiful beads or whatever. The claim to be descended only comes with usurpation. You didn't have to make the claim before then. The religious figurehead, the shaman, identified you as that. And the sacred king, you became sacred king by murdering the previous sacred king. There was no doubt that you were God King. You had just murdered the God King with your hands. Over a long period of time, the temple system degenerated and demonology intervened. This is true. This is good history. The young maidens now had their hearts cut out by wild-eyed priests on the steps of old pyramids. This isn't true. This is only the case in South America, and they didn't kill these girls. That's not what happened. That's not what happened. That never happened. If it happened anywhere, it happened rarely for specific reasons, and not on pyramids. Just not in pyramids. Read your Joseph Campbell. Didn't happen. Some cultures sacrificed animals. We'd been sacrificing animals for tens of thousands of years. The entire Indo-European religious system, including the Vedas and the Avestas, and the Greek and Roman systems, were entirely about sacrificing animals in the correct way. The sacrifices were the only thing that mattered to the ordinary practitioner. The ordinary living person doing the sacrifices in the proper way was the only thing that mattered. You needed the ancestors and the gods to receive the sacrifice. Abraham of the Bible was ordered to take his son to a mountaintop and cut out his heart, trussing him and sacrificing him like a goat. The voice of God intervened at the last minute and said, in effect, I was only kidding, Abraham. And no, he wasn't. And no, that's not what happened. That's not what happened. The voice did intervene and said, you've proven that you were willing to do the sacrifice in the correct way. This sacrifice is no longer necessary because of this sacrificial covenant between us in this moment. Abraham is also a fictional character. Today, when someone hears a voice in his head urging him to do destructive things, we toss him into an asylum and brand him as schizophrenic. Today, we make them extremely famous on YouTube, and then we get mad when they get assassinated in public. But in earlier times, such people were often considered to be holy prophets and were elevated to positions of leadership. Not true. In earlier times, the sacred king would bludgeon them to death with his bare hands. Long periods of history were dominated by crazy fanatics who led their people into horrific or horribly destructive wars. And now, that's not untrue, but John Keel, is scarred by World War II. And so all of this, he's just interpreting World War II. Tools of the gods. Until recent times, and I'll explain to you why he thinks this about World War II and why he's painting World War II on every historical person. Until recent times, religion was the most important single force on this planet. It still is. Men suffered incredible hardship and voluntarily performed the most arduous kinds of labor to prove their faiths. Building the mounds and pyramids was undoubtedly just another demonstration of faith. It was. The gods of the ancients were feared more than loved. Feared, in their language, means revered. So yeah, they were revered. They weren't loved. And whole societies revolved entirely around religious rites and practices. You didn't love the ancient gods. You feared them. You revered them. You did what was necessary for them not to destroy you. Utterly. Nearly all of the great monuments and structures of the ancient world that remain standing today, were of a purely religious nature. This is not true. Men lived in grass huts while they built mighty stone and gold temples for their gods. This is only true circa 11,000 BCE. They didn't have the archaeology in the 80s. He doesn't know what he's talking about. Great cities were erected not as centers of commerce, but as centers of worship. He's false about that. They were developed only for and only because of commerce. Cities. Each year, the believers traveled for many miles to these centers to contribute labor to the local pyramid project. That's true. Perhaps they also witnessed mysterious manifestations which increased their belief. Also true. Studies of thousands of modern UFO sightings have discovered that the enigmatic flying saucers tend to appear around the 21st through the 24th of the month. This pattern was true in 1879 as well as 1978. Strange lights and aerial objects were frequently seen in ancient times, too, and were probably concentrated around the same days of the month. Coincidentally, the biggest pagan holidays in ancient times were the summer and winter solstice, June 21st and December 21st. It's actually not true. The biggest holidays weren't on the solstices. They were on the equinoxes. The biggest holidays were actually on the equinox. So Samhain and Midsummer were actually the more important holidays. Those were the days that they planned. Those were fertility days that they planned pregnancies around. These are the days when the sun has no northward or southward motion and seems to reverse itself. These days were only important to the calendar religions of the Iron Age. The days grow longer or shorter. The winter solstice became the most important single holiday in most cultures and was generally celebrated on December 24th, 3 days after the actual event. And this is fiddly bullshit that's not actually true. Stonehenge and many other ancient monuments were carefully aligned with the movements of the sun and stars so priests could pinpoint the time of the solstices. This isn't entirely true. Those monuments weren't actually clocks by that time. They weren't actually clocks by that time. They were actually erected to know where we were within the procession of the equinoxes. They were actually not clocks like he's referring to Easter. And he's trying to, you may or may not know that medieval cathedrals in Europe have a sun thing. They have the aisle that runs north south in the church, or whatever way it runs in the church. It has a hole, and the church is constructed with a hole in such a way that a beam of light will come in the church at a certain time of day, and as the year goes forward, the light will move up and down. That little pinprick of light, that little beam, will move up and down on the floor until it reaches Easter. Um, no, not a sundial. That is not what Stonehenge was for. Stonehenge was for observing where the planet is within the outer space, within our solar system and our galaxy. Those were there so they could look up in the sky and say, okay, we're looking at this planet on this day of the year. That means that we are in this part of the universe, because they were tracking celestial bodies. They were tracking asteroids, comets, meteors. They were tracking those and had been tracking those since at least the construction of Göbekli Tepe, because that's what Göbekli Tepe is. They're tracking stars by doing that. And we know that they didn't know this because we hadn't figured out what the observatories on Malta are. But the observatories on Malta move around, and if we could date them by their construction, what we'd be able to find is that they were moving them to follow specific stars in the night sky, so they could orient their proprioceptive map of where the planet was as it hurtles around the sun through our galaxy. They were carefully aligned with the movements of the sun and certain stars, but it wasn't so they could pinpoint the time of the solstices. That didn't happen until after Easter was important. That didn't happen until long, long after the Iron Age. But Stonehenge was moved to do that thing around the Iron Age. The appearances of mysterious lights and objects concurrent with the holidays were undoubtedly viewed as godly activities, because the celestial bodies were understood as intelligent, as gods. Although Christ was probably born sometime in March or April, no one actually knows for certain, Christians eventually chose to celebrate his birthday on the Roman holiday of Saturnalia. It's actually not Saturnalis, it is Saturnalia. December 25th, the winter solstice of the ancient calendars. It was a tradition to exchange gifts on Saturnalis, so the early Christian leaders, this isn't true. A clever and devious lot continued that tradition while changing the meaning of the holiday. The gift giving thing on Christmas, that didn't happen until the modern era. That's Coke. We give gifts like that on Christmas because of Coke, and competition with Hanukkah. But Hanukkah is a very modern holiday. That didn't happen until like the 18th or 19th century. It might have happened in the 20th century that they started celebrating Hanukkah in the way they did. But the gift giving thing, um, on Saturnalia was not what he's describing. Saturnalia was a human sacrifice day where they fucked children and ate them. That isn't why Christianity put Christmas on the day of Saturnalia, on the 25th, because they put Christmas on Saturnalia so people would stop fucking kids and eating them. That's why they put Christmas there. They were like, Jesus was born on this day. Stop eating children. That's why Christmas is on the 25th. Um, the 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 gift giving is because on Christmas and Easter the church passed out clothes to the poor. And so families that could afford clothes gave their children clothes on Christmas. That's where Christmas, the gift giving, comes from. Those same clever Christians, those same clever Christians pulled another coup when they declared that Christ had died around the time of the vernal equinox. And this isn't true. What he's saying here isn't true. Jesus died 3 days after the Seder or whatever, and the Passover ceremony. Ancient holidays didn't happen on the day. They were celebrated oftentimes for a week leading up to the day, but usually 3 days before the day. The celebration began and ran for 3 days, and the big celebration was on the night before, so everybody could be hungover on the day of. So Jesus being arrested on Passover and killed 3 days later, that's on purpose. That's not, I mean, you're sure the Christians are being clever, but if it was a historical event, it was the Romans being deliberately ironic and deliberately harming them on on a sacred day, harming Jesus and his followers on a day sacred to their followers on the proper day. That was them demonstrating that they understood how their religion worked and hurting them on purpose. The Romans and the Greeks had done this to the Jews before Jesus' lifetime. They would attack them on holy days because they knew the Jews wouldn't fight back. He's wrong about this. This was already an ancient pagan holiday, paying tribute to our old friend Ashtar, known as Easter to the Anglo-Saxons. He's wrong about this. It's known as Wester, Oestre, not Eastre. He's wrong about this. It was known as Wester, and he's just wrong about this. Easter and Wester have nothing to do with one another. They just look similar because they're the way they're spelled. Taking the Easter name came to cover up Wester, but that had the two things have nothing to do with one another. And the Anglo-Saxons were not the only Proto-Germanic speaking descendant language, Proto-Germanic descendant language. He's just wrong about this. But they were wrong about this. Everybody was wrong about this in the 1980s. As the goddess of fertility, it was natural that she was associated with rabbits and eggs. And again, he's being funny. Again, the Christians adopted the trappings of the holiday while altering its meaning. Sort of. The eggs and bunnies thing is, again, that's a modern, either 19th or 20th century American capitalist holiday. It has nothing to do with the ancient religions. Nothing whatsoever. Thus, two of the most important holidays of antiquity, based upon the observations of the sun through hinges and medicine wheels, were perpetuated by the new Christian religions, where men had once gathered. And the perpetuated, it wasn't that they were perpetuated, it was that the calendar worked. They desperately, he doesn't know what he's talking about, because we only recently looked back on that era and realized the turmoil. The era of history that he's talking about is one of the most turbulent eras in human history, and the Christians desperately needed working calendars because the Jewish calendar, the calendar in the Hebrew Bible, does not work. It doesn't work. So they desperately needed working calendars, and the Germanic peoples, the people of Europe that weren't Italian, had working calendars. So they just adopted the working calendars, where men had once gathered in forests and holy places to offer sacrifices on the solstices and mostly on the equinoxes, actually. Modern worshippers unwittingly continued the ancient traditions by gathering in buildings with vaulted ceilings and fluted pillars meant to emulate the atmosphere of the forests on the same dates. In some religions, it wasn't meant to emulate that atmosphere at all. They were built to emulate the kingdom of heaven. In some religions, wine replaced the blood that was drunk during the earlier pagan ceremonies, and new legends replaced the old. In some religions, he's sort of right about that. But the blood and wine were two different ceremonies. The drinking the blood and LSA laced wines, those were different ceremonies. He's trying to say that the bull and blood drinking of Mithras and Jesus's wine thing are the same because there's drinking happening, but they're not the same. The Christmas on December 25th and Mithras being born on the 25th, those are coincidences that had absolutely nothing whatsoever the fuck ever to do with early Christianity. That had everything to do with Roman copying Persian religion. Mithras was a Persian religion that had nothing to do with Jesus whatsoever. If the Jesus cult copied his stuff, it was because it would be popular in Rome, and they weren't trying to be popular in Rome. What they were doing was the Dionysus cult, which already was doing LSA laced wine and human sacrifice. That was already happening. Jesus was trying to replace the Eucharist of Dionysus with the Eucharist of Christianity. Same ceremony, same wine. Thus, ancient observatory. The builders of the Great Pyramid at Giza undoubtedly raised it slowly in layers like the mound and pyramid builders of the Americas. No, they built it really quickly. The layout of the Grand Gallery and other interior features suggest that the partially built pyramid served for years as an astronomical observatory, using aligned stones in the same way that the hinges and burrows of Northern Europe acted as computers, and the Egyptians weren't interested in star maps. They had no reason to be. They weren't far enough north to be bothered by the asteroids that fall on the northern hemisphere, up on the northern the North Pole. The only object in the Great Pyramid, a crude stone bathtub-like sarcophagus, was installed in the uppermost chamber during construction and may have served a purpose other than that of a coffin. The so-called ventilation shafts leading into the chamber from the outside walls were lined up with the star group known as the Pleiades. People say different things about this, and this is wrong. Other features of the pyramid are aligned to the position of the sun during the solstices. It was never used as a tomb, but it may have served as a storage place for some special religious relic. There are theories that the Ark of the Covenant of Moses was once stored there, or the mysterious black rock of the Muslims was kept in that stone bathtub. Neither of those things is true. We do know that the Great Pyramid survived a number of earthquakes and that it was even repaired after one quake. One fanciful theorist has suggested that the Egyptian priest foresaw some horrible disaster and built the pyramid to house scrolls containing all ancient knowledge. After the disaster passed, the scrolls were removed again. No, that didn't happen either. Traces on the walls of the inner chambers indicate that great quantities of salt were once stored there. Salt? Could it be that the pyramid area was once underwater? How were the enormous stones in the pyramids quarried? Primitive copper tools have been found, and archaeologists believe that the soft metal served the pyramid builders. No, they don't. But a number of pyramids have inner chambers of carved yellow quartzite, a very tough substance. Copper tools could not cut it. Skillfully carved blocks of quartzite weighing over 100 tons were used for the tomb of Imandes and others, and the mortuary temple of Mykerinus contains blocks weighing 200 tons. Well, that's fine. They could move large blocks. They did. The ancient Egyptians had methods that have now been lost. They were able to transport the huge blocks hundreds of miles and then lift them into place. The same methods may have been used to move the giant stones of Stonehenge in England and the building blocks of the mysterious structures found in the Andes Mountains in South America. There had to be a single worldwide culture at one point in ancient history. No, there didn't. There just didn't. And there didn't have to be because there wasn't. We've looked and there is just no evidence, none whatsoever. There was no single monoculture at any point in human history. We were too diffuse and the world is too big. We have a hard time today remembering how large the world is because of airplanes and telephones, but it was too big. It was just too big. The world is too big to traverse on foot in one lifetime. It's just too big. We do our ancestors a great injustice by singling out a solitary project, the Great Pyramid, as deserving of our awe and admiration. I agree with that. Something or someone inspired the ancients to perform incredible feats of construction. Was the source of this inspiration godly apparitions or astronauts from across the cosmos? No, it was international trade. It was trade. He said that the cities weren't built to support commerce, but they were. And these religions became monolithic and megalithic in the way they did to support commerce. Was all of mankind once the slaves of mysterious gods? No, they were the slaves to mysterious commerce. They were the slaves to commerce. They did everything they did so the city could prosper, so the city could have access to resources, because they hadn't figured out personal ownership yet. So what happened is traders went out to a city, they traded what they had for things in that, and that for goods in that city, their wares for their goods, right? They bring the goods back to their city, they give the goods to the temple, and then the temple divvies them out across the city in ways that will benefit everyone. That is, in fact, how ancient settlement worked. That's how ancient tribe worked. That's how hunter-gatherers worked. They worked as a tribe, as a community, to get food and beautiful things. They brought the resources back to the specialist who could turn the beautiful things into food, into edibles, supplies, and beautiful things. And then they portioned it out among the community. The big man or king was responsible for making sure with violence that no one cheated. That's how this played out. That's how it played out for 300,000 years of near Homo sapien culture, and that's probably how it played out for 700,000 years of near Homo sapien culture. That's just how our species has existed for 1,000,000 years. It is only within the last 3,000 years that we have got this wrong. Why? What happened 3,000 years ago? The lethal killing technology of iron happened. That's what happened. The big man could now surround himself with other big men who had lethal force. And he could surround himself with little men who had killing weapons at very long range. When you put iron arrowheads when you put iron tips on an arrow, you're talking about very, very distant lethal weapons. And that's really the show. That's what actually changed. It's always been about commerce. But in the Iron Age, commerce bought iron weapons. Iron is almost useless to those people except as weapons. Bronze is a better tool. Bronze makes better pots. Bronze makes better, well, just cooking supplies. Bronze makes better cooking supplies. And stone pottery makes better everything else than iron does back then. Today, iron is so plentiful and we make it and we use it for so much because of the 19th and 20th centuries. We forget that iron is heavy, it's brittle, and once you break something with iron, it's fucking junk. And that's the show. Thank you for being here. Reading this stuff where Keel is wrong is just as instructive. It's important to me. I read material like this to challenge my own recall of the information, to challenge my own ability to hold bad information at bay. So whether I believe that Keel is right or not in his core thesis, whether I think any of this information is valid, it's important to know what is out in the cultural milieu. It's important to know what other people think, because they don't challenge themselves. So the only way to get better is to challenge yourself, and the only way to know that you're better than somebody else is to directly challenge yourself against them and win. You have to also win. So take care.